On June 5th, 1972, a woman in a black Givenchy dress sat in the choir of St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, and watched a coffin draped in the royal standard being carried past her. She was 75 years old. She was thin to the point of frailty. She had flown from Paris the day before and slept at Buckingham Palace, the first time she had been under that roof since the night 36 years earlier, when her presence had made it uninhabitable. Beside the coffin walked members of a family she had never been admitted to. Somewhere behind her sat the Queen Mother, the woman who had held her responsible for 3 decades for the destruction of her husband's health. Neither woman looked at the other. The flowers on the altar were white. The man in the coffin had once been King of England. The name on the order of service was Edward, Duke of Windsor. But the story that ended in that chapel did not begin with him. It began with the dynasty his father built from a wartime act of reinvention. The House of Windsor, a name invented in 1917 to sound ancient, and with a code duty before self, silence over confession, the crown above everything. This is the story of what happened when that code was broken. Not just to the man who broke it, but to the brother whose life it shortened, the niece whose destiny it rewrote, and the woman at its center who spent 35 years managing a man the world called romantic, and she experienced as inescapable, and who then spent 14 more years alone in a Paris house, while a lawyer decided what remained of her life. To understand how it ended, the rented house in Paris, the desk with fresh ink still in the pen, the old man waiting by the door for the woman he had made it impossible to leave, you have to go back further than 1936, further than the abdication, further than the moment a king chose a twice divorced American over the most powerful throne in the world. You have to go back to the making of the name itself. Because the House of Windsor was not ancient, it was invented. And the man who invented it understood something about monarchy that his eldest grandson never would. That the crown survives not on glamour or love or personal magnetism, but on the willingness to disappear inside a role. George V was born on June 3rd, 1865, the second son of the Prince of Wales. He was not expected to be king. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, was the heir, charming in a vague way, considered by some in court circles to lack the intellectual sharpness the role demanded, but the heir nonetheless. When Albert Victor died of pneumonia in January 1892, at the age of 28, the succession fell to George. He was a naval man by training and by temperament, orderly, practical, uncomfortable with abstraction, more at ease on a quarterdeck than in a drawing room. He married Princess Mary of Teck in 1893, a woman whose own path to the throne had been rerouted by the same death. She had been engaged to Albert Victor and was, in a sense, transferred to his brother, along with the dynastic expectation. Their partnership was not built on passion. It was built on shared commitment to a code that both of them understood instinctively. The monarchy existed for the nation, not for the individuals who happened to wear its titles. Personal feeling was a private matter. Public duty was everything. That code crystallized during the First World War. In 1917, with Britain locked in a conflict against Germany that had already cost hundreds of thousands of lives, the royal family's name became a liability. The house had been called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a German name inherited through Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, and the association had become politically poisonous. Anti-German sentiment ran through every level of British society. German-owned shops were attacked. German-sounding names were changed. The king's own cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the face of the enemy. George understood, with the practical intelligence that defined his reign, that the monarchy could not survive if it sounded like the thing the nation was dying to defeat. On July 17th, 1917, he issued a royal proclamation renaming the house Windsor, after the castle, after the English landscape, after something that sounded as though it had always been there. The Kaiser reportedly joked that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, but the joke concealed an important truth. George had just demonstrated that monarchy in the modern age was an act of management, of image, of controlled reinvention. The House of Windsor was born not from centuries of tradition, but from a wartime branding exercise by a king who grasped that survival required performance above all else. The performance became the family's operating system. George V built a monarchy on visible duty, public restraint, constitutional obedience, and the systematic compression of personal appetite into institutional service. Christmas broadcasts, carefully managed public appearances, the deliberate cultivation of the royal family as national family, these were George's innovations, and they worked because they were rooted in a genuine belief that the crown was larger than any individual who wore it. He expected his children to understand that belief as though it were scripture. He expected them to subordinate their desires to the machinery of the state without complaint, without negotiation, without the expectation that the role would feel good. He expected, above all, that they would grasp what the crown was not. It was not a stage for personal desire, not a vehicle for private satisfaction, not a possession to be reshaped according to the temperament of whoever happened to inherit it. The crown was a burden, and the measure of a monarch was the willingness to carry it in silence. Queen Mary reinforced the code from the domestic side with a rigor that matched her husband's public discipline. She was a woman of formidable bearing, immense self control, and an almost architectural sense of how royal life should be constructed and maintained. Born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, she had been raised in the penumbra of the royal family, close enough to understand its expectations from the inside, marginal enough to have known what it felt like to depend on the goodwill of wealthier relatives. That background gave her a particular inflexibility about form. She had lived the reality of insecure status, and she had no patience for anyone who treated secure status carelessly. Her household was orderly, her expectations unyielding, her tolerance for emotional indulgence close to non existent. She believed in duty as a kind of spiritual discipline, not joyful, not rewarding in any personal sense, but necessary and ennobling precisely because it was hard. Between them, George and Mary built a family culture that functioned on impersonality. Feelings were managed by suppressing them. Problems were managed by not discussing them. The institution came first. The person inside the title came a distant second. That was the Windsor Code. That was what it meant to carry the name. And the eldest son, the heir, the golden boy of empire, the man the public adored more than any royal since Victoria, could not bear it. Into that system, on June the 23rd, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, was born Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known within the family as David, known to the empire as the Prince of Wales, and known eventually to history as the king who could not inhabit the role his birth had assigned him. He was the eldest of 6 children. He was the heir from the moment he drew breath. And from the earliest accounts of those who observed him closely, tutors, courtiers, later biographers working from letters and diaries, he was fundamentally, perhaps irreparably, mismatched to the expectations that surrounded him. The public never saw that mismatch. What the public saw, particularly through the 1920s, was electrifying. Edward was handsome, slim, fair-haired, and effortlessly charismatic in a way that no British royal had been within living memory. He toured the empire and was met with a fervor that bordered on celebrity worship. In Canada, in Australia, in India, in South Africa, crowds surged and wept and pressed forward to touch him. Women adored him. The press adored him. He dressed with a sharpness that men imitated across the empire, spoke with an apparent informality that felt revolutionary coming from a prince, and moved through the world as though monarchy was something that could be worn lightly rather than endured. He was, in the language of his time, modern, a word that meant freedom from his father's generation, freedom from Victorian stiffness, freedom from the gray machinery of obligatory duty. He seemed to promise a crown that could smile. He was the glamorous front end of the house his father had built, the face that made service look like style and obligation feel like grace. But the private Edward, the one known to family, to staff, to the women who moved through his emotional life, was a markedly different figure. Biographers and historians return, with striking consistency, to the same cluster of traits: volatile, emotionally adolescent, resistant to the disciplines of office, prone to grievance and self-pity when thwarted, and desperately, almost compulsively in need of attachment. He wanted to be admired without being constrained. He wanted the warmth of public adoration without the coldness of constitutional paperwork. He wanted love, and not as companionship or equal partnership, but as a consuming, total, reassuring presence that would fill the space where self sufficiency should have been. His father saw it, his staff saw it. The women who occupied the center of his life understood it, perhaps better than anyone. His romantic pattern was already clearly established long before Wallis. There were intense, consuming attachments to married women. Frida Dudley Ward for over a decade, then Thelma Furness, and in each case, the dynamic was identical. He pursued with overwhelming, flattering attention, attached with emotional ferocity, and expected from the woman a kind of total service that went beyond affection into something closer to the management of a difficult, brilliant, needy child. He needed to be organized, scheduled, emotionally regulated, and constantly reassured that he was loved. The pattern was not new when Wallis entered the picture. What was new was that the next woman to fill the role would do so from a position that made the pattern constitutionally catastrophic. On the other side of the Atlantic, the woman who would become the Duchess of Windsor was being formed by an entirely different kind of precariousness, not royal, not institutional, but domestic and financial. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June the 19th, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, and raised in Baltimore. Her father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, came from one of the city's established families. There was name, there was social standing, there was membership in the particular, sharply graded world of Baltimore society, where who your people were mattered more than what you earned. But Teakle died of tuberculosis when Wallace was still an infant, not yet a year old, and with his death, the security evaporated. Her mother, Alice, was left without independent means, dependent on the generosity of relatives, specifically on Wallace's uncle, Solomon Davies Warfield, a railway executive who provided financial support but extracted deference and gratitude and a particular kind of submission in return. The Warfield name opened doors in Baltimore, but behind those doors, the ground was never quite steady. There was always a benefactor to please, always a margin of dependence that could not be acknowledged openly, always the knowledge that respectability and security were not the same thing. There is something about that childhood worth sitting with for a moment because it explains so much of what Wallis became and what she built in exile. She grew up knowing what it felt like to be inside a family and yet contingent on its goodwill. She learned very young that stability was not a birthright. It was something you manufactured through effort, through the careful management of impressions, through the meticulous control of your surroundings and the people within them. The obsession with order, dress, hospitality, and physical environment that would later define her decades in Paris. The exacting table settings, the flowers arranged with military precision, the guest lists curated with surgical care and discarded through what the household staff called the grumble book, the rooms polished to a gleam that bordered on aggression. These were not the frivolities of a shallow socialite amusing herself in exile. They were the coping mechanisms of someone who had understood since childhood that the world could be made to feel manageable through the governance of surfaces. If you controlled the room, you controlled the situation. If the silver was right and the flowers were right and the conversation was right, then the life inside the room could be endured, no matter how empty or trapped or purposeless it actually felt. She was educated at Oldfield, a school for the daughters of Baltimore's better families, and she moved through the particular social strata of early 20th century American gentility. Respectable, ambitious, constrained by gender and by means, sharper and funnier and more watchful than most of the rooms she entered. She married Earl Winfield Spencer, a naval aviator, in 1916. The marriage was a disaster. Spencer was an alcoholic, controlling, and by several accounts physically abusive. They separated, reconciled, separated again, and finally divorced in 1927 after years of mutual unhappiness. She married Ernest Simpson, an American-born British shipping broker, in 1928 and moved to London. Ernest was cultured, steady, socially at ease, and genuinely devoted to her. Anne Seba's later biographical work argues, with considerable supporting evidence from letters and testimony, that Ernest may have been the deeper emotional love of Wallis's life, that their marriage offered genuine intellectual companionship, social ease, and a life that was interesting and stimulating without being catastrophic. Ernest Simpson is the life not taken. He is the husband who represented manageability, affection, without entrapment, ambition, without annihilation. He is the marriage Wallis would later come to understand. She had surrendered for something far larger and far more suffocating than anything she had ever intended or desired. But there is a figure who must be understood before the crisis unfolds because his life would be broken by it more completely and more permanently than anyone else's. Prince Albert, Bertie, was born on December the 14th, 1895, the second son, the spare heir, the brother who existed in the constitutional plan as a safety net and in the family dynamic as a contrast. Where Edward was golden and effortless in public, Bertie was anxious, stammering, and forced to endure a childhood in which his natural shyness and physical awkwardness were treated as deficiencies to be corrected rather than temperamental realities to be understood. He was knock-kneed as a child and made to wear painful corrective splints. He was naturally left-handed and forced to write with his right. His stammer and severe, publicly humiliating, a source of deep and lasting anguish, was a torment in a family in a world that valued fluent public performance above almost everything else. What Bertie wanted, by every account that survives, was not the throne. He did not covet his brother's position. He wanted to do his duty, reliably, unglamorously, without the suffocating glare of the spotlight that Edward seemed to need the way other people needed air. He married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923. She was Scottish aristocracy, warmly sociable on the surface, steely and perceptive underneath the charm, and devoted to the conviction that royal life could be borne, even valued if it was underpinned by genuine family feeling rather than the cold mechanics of obligation alone. Together, they built a domestic world that was quiet, stable, and happy in a way that Edward's life never was. They had two daughters, Princess Elizabeth, born in 1926, and Princess Margaret, born in 1930. And their family life was constructed entirely around the assumption that Edward would be king, and they would be allowed to live usefully, quietly in his shadow. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was not a passive figure in any of this. She was shrewd, fiercely protective of her husband's well-being, deeply aware of what the crown demanded from those who carried it, and possessed of a social warmth that concealed a will made of something close to iron. Her response to the abdication crisis, when it came, would harden into something that many who witnessed it described as permanent, unrelenting fury. Not petty social resentment, but a structural rage born from watching the man she loved forced into a role that was visibly, physically destroying him, and knowing exactly whose selfishness had caused it. She believed with justification that even sympathetic accounts of Edward cannot entirely dismiss that the abdication killed her husband, that the weight of an unwanted crown, carried for 16 years with a discipline his brother had never possessed, shortened George VI's life. She would carry that conviction for the remaining 5 decades of her own life, and its presence would shape every interaction the royal family had with the woman who became the Duchess of Windsor. Wallis, by later accounts, was genuinely frightened of encountering her after the Duke's death. That fear was not irrational. It was the recognition of a wound that had never healed because the woman who bore it had never chosen to let it heal. And then there was the child who would inherit everything. Princess Elizabeth was 10 years old in December 1936, bright, orderly, serious in the particular way that eldest daughters of anxious fathers sometimes become, already attuned to the emotional weather of the household around her. Her life was about to be rerouted without her consent, without her understanding, without anyone asking what she wanted, because no one in this family ever asked that question. The abdication would make her father king. That would make her the heir, presumptive to the throne. And everything that followed, the longest reign in British history, the transformation of the monarchy through the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. The particular, exacting, unrelenting weight of a life lived entirely inside a role that permitted no private self, began not with her own choice, but with her uncle's refusal. He could not bear the code. She would bear it for 70 years. The early 1930s were the years when all of these threads began to tangle. Edward met Wallis through the social world that orbited around Thelma Furness and the fashionable Anglo-American set in London, the country weekends at Fort Belvedere, in Windsor Great Park, The dinner parties in Mayfair, the cruising holidays, the stylish entertaining that made the Prince of Wales's circle the most sought after in Britain. Fort Belvedere was the stage on which the attachment formed. It was a castellated folly in the park, a retreat Edward had made his own. Landscape, decorated, jealously guarded as his private domain, a place where the formality of court could be set aside and the prince could live as he wished to live, informally, intensely, surrounded by people who amused and flattered him. The weekends there had a particular rhythm: cocktails, games, conversation, the sense that one was inside the most exclusive circle in England. It was at Fort Belvedere that Edward's attachments to women played out most vividly, and it was there that Wallis's particular abilities, her wit, her sharpness, her capacity to organize a social atmosphere and make it hum, became apparent to him and to everyone else. By 1934, the attachment was undeniable. Wallis brought something none of his previous women had offered in quite the same combination: social brilliance, organizational intelligence, a directness that cut through the deference he received from every other quarter of his life, and a talent for managing atmosphere that turned every room she entered into a production under her control. She was not simply attractive to him, she was useful. And he was not simply attracted to her, he was dependent on her. Dependent in a way that went beyond romance, into something that looked, even to those watching from within the household, like the emotional structure of a child clinging to the one adult who made the world feel ordered and safe. Even before the crisis, before the abdication, before any of it became irreversibly public, they were rehearsing the division of labor that would define the next 35 years of their shared life. He provided status, adoration, and bottomless emotional need. She provided organization, poise, and the daily management of his world. The public, when it eventually learned the outlines of the story, saw romance. A king who loved so deeply he surrendered an empire. What was actually forming in the drawing rooms and at the weekend parties and during the long evenings at Fort Belvedere, where he clung to her presence and she managed his moods, was a system of dependency dressed as devotion, of management mistaken for love, of two damaged people locking themselves into roles that neither fully understood and from which neither would ever be able to escape. George V died on January the 20th, 1936. Edward was 41. Wallis was 39. The man who could not bear the code became the man who wore the crown. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, understood what was gathering and opposed it with the full constitutional weight of the government. The Church of England, of which the monarch was supreme governor, would not sanction marriage to a woman whose former husbands were both still living. The Dominion governments were consulted and were, with few exceptions, firmly opposed. The machinery of the state was aligned against Edward's private desire. Not out of cruelty or snobbery, though both were present, but because the system his father had spent a lifetime building was designed to prevent exactly this: the subordination of the crown to one man's emotional compulsion. What makes the gathering crisis more complicated than its popular version has ever allowed is this: the strongest biographical evidence suggests that Wallis did not want the end point. She did not want to be queen. She did not want Edward to abdicate. She wanted, it appears, what she already had: the excitement of a king's attention, the social elevation, the escape from the manageable but unstimulating life she had built with earnest, without the catastrophic, irreversible consequences that would follow if the king actually chose her over the throne. She tried, at points during the crisis, to pull back. She offered to withdraw. The public did not see those offers. The public saw only the result. There were other figures already gathering at the edges of this story who would carry their own threads across the decades that followed. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was not merely a political obstacle to Edward's desire. He was something more structurally important: the representative of a constitutional system insisting that the crown was not a private possession. Baldwin understood, perhaps better than Edward ever would, that monarchy in a democracy survives only if the monarch accepts limitations that would be intolerable to anyone not raised inside the bargain. His resistance to the marriage was not personal hostility toward Wallis, though personal distaste was clearly present. It was the state saying no to a king who had mistaken the throne for a chair he could rearrange to suit his comfort. Behind the principal figures were the people who would witness the private reality once the public drama was over. Sidney Johnson, a young Bahamian man, would first enter the Windsor's service during the wartime years in Nassau when Edward was governor. He would become the Duke's valet and remain with the couple for roughly 3 decades. An extraordinary span of service that made him one of the most intimate witnesses to the marriage's daily texture. Johnson's later testimony gives the story its class dimension and its moral reality. He is the servant who sees the private hierarchy of the household from the inside, who understands the rhythms of dependence and control that no guest at one of Wallis's immaculate dinner parties would ever be permitted to glimpse, and his eventual departure from the household, forced out by his account because Wallis would not accommodate the flexibility he needed to care for his own children, tells you almost everything about the kind of world she ran and the cost of maintaining it. Johanna Schutz, who would serve as the couple's private secretary in their final years together, provides the outline with a different kind of intimacy. Her recollections, published and discussed decades after the events they describe, offer the closest available view of the marriage's emotional architecture in its last phase. It is Schutz who describes the old Duke waiting for Wallis when she left the house and greeting her with desperate relief when she returned. It is Schutz who delivers the line that reframes the entire romance. He trapped her, no question. And it is Schutz who would later testify to the conditions of Wallis's final years under the control of her French lawyer, Suzanne Bloom. Conditions that constitute the story's last and most disturbing chapter. Because Schutz's evidence is retrospective and personal, the product of memory and loyalty. Rather than dispassionate record, it should be understood as witness testimony rather than neutral archive. But as witness testimony, it is devastating, and it is now central to the modern reassessment of who Wallis Simpson actually was. Suzanne Bloom would not enter the story for decades yet, but her shadow belongs in the architecture from the beginning, because she represents the final turn of the screw. A prominent Parisian lawyer, Bloom took control of the Duchess's legal and personal affairs after the Duke's death, and, in the accounts of those who tried to maintain contact with Wallis in her declining years, became something between a protector and a captor, isolating the old woman, blocking visitors, controlling access to the fortune in the archive, and presiding over the slow dismantlement of everything Wallis had built. Whether Bloom acted out of genuine concern, financial self-interest, or some more complicated mixture remains a matter of dispute. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The woman who had spent decades managing every detail of her own environment ended her life in a house she no longer controlled, attended by people she had not chosen, stripped of the agency that had been her only real defense against a world that had never fully accepted her. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. These are the threads. The dynasty that George V constructed from a wartime rebrand, and 4 decades of relentless public discipline. The heir who could not bear the weight of the code. The outsider whose talent for management would become both her survival strategy and her prison. The brother who would carry the crown he never wanted until it killed him. The sister-in-law whose fury would outlast them all. The niece whose life was permanently rerouted by a choice she had no part in making. The servants who saw what the public never did. The lawyer who would close the final door. By the mid-1930s, the family was taking shape in its most consequential configuration. Edward was Prince of Wales, and then, from January 1936, King. Wallis was still married to Ernest Simpson, but moving inexorably toward the center of Edward's world. Bertie and Elizabeth were raising their daughters in the comfortable assumption that someone else would sit on the throne. Queen Mary was watching her eldest son with the particular dread of a mother who understands that the child she cannot control is about to break the thing she spent her life building. And George V, in the final months of his life, was said to have remarked, in one of those private comments that survive because they are too perfectly shaped to be forgotten, that he hoped nothing would come between his eldest son and the throne, and that after he was dead, the boy would ruin himself within 12 months. It was a devastating assessment from a father about his eldest child, and the fact that it circulated at all speaks to the depth of unease within the court. The old king could see what was coming. He could see the mismatch between his son's temperament and the role that awaited him. He could see the woman around whom his son's emotional life was increasingly organized. And he could see, with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime holding the institution together through discipline and self denial, that the man who would inherit it was incapable of either. George V died on January the 20th, 1936, and his prophecy began its fulfillment almost immediately. He was wrong only in the specifics. It took 11 months, not 12. That stability, if it can be called stability, would not last a year. The golden heir was now the impossible king, and the woman who had wanted a king's attention was about to discover that the king wanted something she had never offered and could not survive. Her entire life, permanently, irrevocably, in exile. The dynasty had created a star. The star was about to collide with the system that made him, and the woman who had entered that system from the outside, the woman who would be blamed for everything, pitied for nothing, and understood by almost no one, was not going to destroy it. She was going to be consumed by it. By 1934, the attachment between Edward and Wallis had become, to those who moved in their circle, unmistakable. It was not simply that the Prince of Wales had a new favorite. The court had seen that before, with Frida Dudley Ward, with Thelma Furness, with others whose names the public never learned. It was the quality of the attachment that alarmed people. Edward did not merely enjoy Wallis's company. He oriented his entire emotional existence around her. He telephoned her constantly. He sought her approval on matters of dress, of social arrangement, of daily routine. He deferred to her judgments about people in a way that no prince of his stature should have needed to defer to anyone. And Wallis, for her part, did not resist the role. She organized him. She managed his social calendar with the same precision she brought to a dinner table. She told him what to wear, how to behave, whom to see. Whether she understood at that stage where this was heading, whether she grasped that she was not simply managing a prince's affections, but stepping onto a path that would consume both their lives, is one of the central questions of the story, and it does not have a clean answer. What is clear is that the public image during those years was intoxicating. The couple moved through London society and beyond it. Cruises on the Nalin, through the Adriatic, holidays in the south of France, weekends at Fort Belvedere that felt, to those invited, like admission to the most glamorous private world in England. Edward was still the most famous man in the empire. Wallis was becoming, within the circles that mattered, the most talked about woman in London. Together they looked like modernity entering a stale institution. His charm was genuine. Her social intelligence was formidable. Their energy as a couple was vivid, and to many who observed it, genuinely compelling. The viewer must feel why this looked like the future, why the press, when it finally broke its self-imposed silence, would struggle to explain to the public that the love story of the century was also a constitutional emergency. The daily texture of their world in the mid-30s matters because it establishes the patterns that exile would harden into permanence. The rhythm was London entertaining during the week, Fort Belvedere at weekends, continental travel when it could be arranged, and threading through all of it the constant, almost frantic business of social management. Wallis was already running their shared world with the administrative intensity that would later define the Paris household. Guest lists were assembled and revised. Menus were planned with precision. Edward's wardrobe was supervised. His moods were monitored and managed. The informality of the Prince of Wales's set concealed a domestic operation as tightly controlled as any military household. And at the center of that operation sat Wallis, simultaneously the hostess, the scheduler, the emotional regulator, and the social gatekeeper. She was rehearsing, without knowing it, for the job that would occupy the rest of her life. Ernest Simpson, during these years, was being edged out of his own marriage in slow motion. The accounts of how this happened vary in their degree of sympathy and blame, but the outline is not in serious dispute. Ernest was aware of the relationship. He was aware of its intensity. He was a man of social ambition who had initially been flattered by the royal connection and who then found that the connection had grown into something that made his position untenable. Whether he was asked directly to step aside or whether the stepping aside was accomplished through social pressure and emotional fait accompli is a question that biographers continue to debate. What is not debatable is the result. Ernest Simpson, The man who had offered Wallis a life of genuine partnership and manageable comfort was being replaced by a prince whose emotional needs were so consuming that they would eventually swallow a throne. Wallis's divorce from Ernest, when it came, would not be the liberation the public narrative implied. It would be the closing of the last door through which she might have walked back to an ordinary life. George V died on January the 20th, 1936. Edward was king, and within months, the structure that his father had spent decades building was under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. The crisis gathered through the spring and summer of 1936 with the particular momentum of a scandal that everyone in power knows about and no one in the public can yet see. The American press had been covering the relationship openly. Magazines and newspapers across the Atlantic treated the Prince of Wales's attachment to the American divorcee as one of the great romantic stories of the age, an exotic, glamorous, a democratic fairy tale in which love conquered the stuffiness of an ancient monarchy. The British press, bound by a voluntary code of deference to the crown that seems almost incomprehensible from a modern distance, said nothing. The silence was not ignorance. Editors knew, politicians knew, the Archbishop of Canterbury knew. The Dominion prime ministers had been consulted. Wallis's divorce proceedings against Ernest were already underway in Ipswich. The machinery of catastrophe was fully assembled and running. The British public simply had not been told. Stanley Baldwin's resistance was constitutional and implacable. The prime minister understood that the marriage of the king to a twice-divorced woman, whose former husbands were both living, was impossible under the existing framework, not merely socially awkward, but constitutionally unworkable. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England. The church did not recognize divorce in the way that permitted remarriage under these circumstances. The Dominion governments, when sounded out, were clear. They would not accept Wallis as queen consort, and a morganatic marriage, in which she would be the king's wife but not the queen, was a constitutional novelty that no one wished to create. Baldwin was not being vindictive. He was being the system, speaking back to a man who had confused the crown with a personal ornament. The private story of the crisis is more agonizing than the constitutional one, and it is here that the strongest evidence against the fairy tale version accumulates. Time magazine later reported that at the height of the crisis, Wallis had second thoughts. Anne Seba's biographical reading is even more direct. Now, Wallis never wanted to be married to an ex-king. She had wanted the affair, the elevation, the glamour, not the sacrifice, not the exile, not the permanent attachment to a man who would have no role, no purpose, and no emotional resources beyond her presence. She offered at several points to withdraw from the situation. Whether those offers were genuine attempts to prevent the abdication or strategic gestures designed to look noble, while the outcome was already settled, is another question the sources cannot definitively resolve. What the sources do agree on is this: she was not the calculating seductress of the public caricature. She was a woman watching a situation spiral beyond her control, and understanding, with increasing horror, that the man at the center of it was prepared to bring everything down rather than live without her. Johannes Schutz's much later formulation, recalled decades after the events, is the bluntest version of this reading. He trapped her, no question. That is testimony, not documentation. It carries the weight of someone who observed the marriage at close range for years, but it also carries the limitations of retrospect and personal loyalty. The script should hold both. The evidence, taken together from biographers, from contemporaries, from later witnesses, builds a picture that is not of a woman who schemed to steal a crown, but of a woman who reached for a king's attention and found that the king's need was so vast and so unyielding that it consumed the possibility of retreat. The abdication, when it came, was swift and ceremonially precise in a way that belied the emotional chaos beneath it. On December the 10th, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward signed the instrument of abdication in the presence of his three surviving brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. The document was witnessed. The constitutional act was complete. The following day, December the 11th, the abdication took legal effect, and that evening Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, the title his brother would bestow, went to Windsor Castle, and broadcast to the nation and the empire. The words he used fixed the public myth for a generation. He could not carry the heavy burden of kingship, he said, without the help and support of the woman I love. It was the most famous sentence any British monarch had ever spoken, and it was a lie of omission so complete that it would take decades to unpick. He did not mention that Wallis had tried to pull back. He did not mention that the sacrifice was, in its deepest structure, not a noble choice, but an emotional compulsion. He framed the abdication as a love story. The reality was that a man who could not function without a particular woman's management had made both their lives irreversible. The immediate consequences fell on everyone simultaneously. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, stripped of his sovereignty but not his title. Wallis was not yet his wife, the divorce from Ernest was not final, and the wedding could not take place until the following summer. But she was already, in the eyes of the world, the woman for whom a king had given up his throne. The royal family's response was to close ranks with a speed and severity that Edward seems never to have anticipated. George VI, Bertie, the stammering second son, the man who had wanted only to serve quietly in his brother's shadow, was now king, and the weight of the crown sat visibly and painfully on a man whose constitution was not built for it. Elizabeth, now queen consort, moved into a phase of controlled permanent anger that would define her relationship with the Windsors for the rest of her life. Queen Mary, the matriarch, chose dynasty over her eldest son, a choice that was entirely consistent with the code she had spent her life embodying and that severed the mother-son relationship in ways that never fully healed. And Princess Elizabeth, 10 years old, became the heir presumptive to the British throne because her uncle could not live without a woman the system refused to accept. The denial of the title, Her Royal Highness to Wallis, was the family's sharpest weapon, and it was deployed with precision. Edward was a Royal Highness. His wife would not be. The distinction was social, legal, and deeply personal. It meant that Wallis would carry the title of Duchess, but would never be accorded the full status of a member of the royal family. Women were expected to curtsy to her husband, but not to her. The insult was calibrated to wound, and it did. Edward would rage about it for the rest of his life. Wallis would absorb it as one more piece of evidence that the system she had been drawn into would never accept her, no matter what she had sacrificed or what she endured. The wedding took place on June the 3rd, 1937, at Château de Condé, a Renaissance castle near Tours, belonging to a Franco-American businessman named Charles Bedeau. It was, by every external measure, a beautiful occasion. The grounds were manicured, the flowers were magnificent, the bride wore pale blue main-bochet. The groom looked relieved and elated, but the absence at the center of the scene told the real story. Not a single member of the British royal family attended. No representative was sent. The message was as public as the abdication broadcast had been, and its meaning was unmistakable. The family that bore the name Windsor would not witness, sanctify, or celebrate this marriage. The wedding was a coronation in reverse, a ceremony that conferred a title while withdrawing all the belonging that should have accompanied it. Cecil Beaton photographed the couple. The images are studied, poised, and impeccably composed. They showed two people who look, on their wedding day, as though they are already performing the version of their lives that the rest of the world would be allowed to see. The performance would continue for 35 years. And behind it, out of sight of Beaton's camera and the public that consumed his photographs, the real marriage, the daily management, the emotional dependency, the grievance, the diminishing options, and the slow transformation of romance into something closer to administration was already beginning. Wallis, during the months between the abdication and the wedding, existed in a peculiar kind of limbo. She was in the south of France, staying with friends, waiting for her divorce from Ernest to become absolute, waiting for the man who had just surrendered the British Empire to join her, and absorbing for the first time the full scale of what had happened. The press followed her. The world watched. She was simultaneously the most famous woman alive and one of the most isolated. The letters she wrote during this period, some later published, others quoted by biographers, reveal not triumph, but something closer to disorientation. A woman recalibrating her understanding of her own life, realizing that the door through which she had walked led not to a palace, but to a corridor with no exit. Edward, for his part, left England after the broadcast and crossed to France. He was technically a private citizen for the first time in his life, a man without a constitutional role, without an official residence, without the apparatus of monarchy that had surrounded him since birth. He was also, by every available account, ecstatic to be free. That ecstasy would not survive the first year of exile. But in the early months of 1937, before the reality of displacement had fully settled, he was a man who believed he had escaped. He did not yet understand that what he had actually done was exchange one form of confinement for another. The world, meanwhile, was constructing the myth in real time. In 1936, the year of the crisis, Time magazine named Wallis its first Woman of the Year. A recognition that cemented her image not as a complex human being, navigating an impossible situation, but as a symbol, the woman who changed history, the face that launched a constitutional crisis, the American divorcee who brought the British Empire to its knees. That framing would prove almost impossible to displace. It reduced a story of two damaged people, institutional rigidity, emotional compulsion, and a dynasty that could not accommodate private need into something far simpler and far more digestible, a love story. The entire documentary that follows is about how profoundly that simplification failed once the exile began. The wedding at Chateau de Condé, when it finally took place on June the 3rd, 1937, deserves to be understood as more than a ceremony. It was the founding moment of a new domestic reality. Cecil Beaton photographed the couple. Wallis wore a long, pale blue dress designed by Maine Boucher, an American couturier working in Paris, a choice that was, in its way, a declaration of identity. She was not going to dress like a British royal. She was going to dress like herself, sleek, modern, controlled American. The groom wore a mourning dress. The officiant was a Church of England clergyman who had defied the Bishop of Durham to perform the service, a small act of ecclesiastical rebellion that underlined how far outside the mainstream this marriage sat. The guests were friends, supporters, and members of the international social set. The family, the Windsors, the institution whose name the groom still carried, were nowhere to be seen. Herman Rogers, an old friend of Wallis's from her American life, gave her away. The organ played. Vows were exchanged. And in that moment, the two people standing at the altar became something the British establishment had no framework for. A former king and his wife living abroad, carrying a royal title, sustained by royal money, but excluded from the royal family in every way that mattered. They were Windsors without Windsor, or royals without a court, a dynasty of two with no heirs, no role, and no country that claimed them. The first months after the wedding established the patterns that would define decades. The couple settled into a peripatetic social existence. Houses borrowed, hotels inhabited, friends visited, parties attended. The international circuit of the wealthy displaced traversed with the restless energy of people who have nowhere they need to be and nothing they need to do. Edward's daily life, once organized around red boxes, constitutional audiences, and the relentless schedule of a reigning monarch, was suddenly empty. Wallis filled the vacuum. She gave him a schedule when the state no longer did. She gave him an environment to inhabit when the palaces were closed to him. She gave him, in effect, a replacement for the structure that monarchy had once provided, domestic rather than constitutional, social rather than political, but structure nonetheless. The house, wherever it happened to be, became the institution, and Wallis became its administrator. The German visit in October 1937 was the first and most damaging proof that freedom without purpose produces catastrophic judgment. Edward and Wallis visited Germany at the invitation of the Nazi regime, ostensibly to study housing and industrial conditions. They met Hitler. They were photographed. Wallis reportedly gave what appeared to be a modified Nazi salute. The visit was engineered, at least in part, by Charles Bedaux, the same man who had lent them Chateau de Condé for the wedding and who had extensive business connections in Nazi Germany. Whether the Windsors' motivation were naivety, vanity, political sympathy, a desire to demonstrate that they could still operate on the world stage, or some combination of all four has been debated by historians for nearly a century. What is not debatable is the result. The ex-king of England, 5 months after his wedding, was photographed shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. The image would follow them for the rest of their lives. It transformed Edward from an embarrassment into a political liability, and it gave the British establishment, already hostile, a permanent justification for keeping them at arm's length. The consequences of the German visit compounded across the following years in ways that went far beyond public relations. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Edward and Wallis were in the south of France. The question of what to do with a former king who had been photographed with the Fuhrer and whose political sympathies were, at minimum, suspect became an urgent matter of state security. Churchill, by then First Lord of the Admiralty and soon to be Prime Minister, understood that Edward could not be allowed to remain in continental Europe, where the Germans might attempt to use him, either as a diplomatic tool or, in the worst case, as the figurehead of a puppet British government. The solution Churchill engineered was exile within exile. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a colonial posting so minor and so distant that it amounted to a polite form of banishment. The Bahamas years, from 1940 to 1945, deserve close attention because they are the period in which the last residue of glamour was burned away. Government House in Nassau was, by Edward's own complaint, shambles, termite-ridden, poorly maintained, with plaster falling from the ceilings and conditions that he considered beneath the dignity of a man who had once been king emperor. The couple moved temporarily to another property while repairs were undertaken. Wallis dismissed one alternative residence as a shack by the sea. The complaints were petty, self-pitying, and entirely in character, but they also reveal something more important. This was a man experiencing for the first time the real scale of his diminishment. He had gone from Buckingham Palace to a termite-eaten colonial outpost. The empire he had briefly ruled was fighting for its survival, and his contribution to that fight was to administer a chain of islands in the Caribbean. The humiliation was not subtle. Wallis coped the way she always coped, by managing the environment. She threw herself into the renovation of Government House, into the social life of Nassau, into the business of making the situation tolerable through the imposition of order and style. She was good at it. By all accounts, the Government House entertainments were polished, the household was well run, and Wallis brought to Nassau the same combination of social precision and decorative perfectionism that she had deployed in London and would later deploy in Paris. But the effort was masking something that had no remedy. They were trapped. The war prevented movement, the posting prevented return. The political contamination of the German visit prevented rehabilitation. And the marriage, now 4 years old, was settling into its permanent emotional configuration. His need, her management, his grievance, her control, and the growing, suffocating interdependence of two people who had no one else. Sidney Johnson entered their service during the Bahamas years, a young Bahamian man who became the Duke's valet and who would remain with the couple in various capacities for roughly 3 decades. His presence in the household was significant for reasons that went beyond personal service. Johnson was one of the only people in the Windsor's world who was neither a social equal nor a temporary employee, but a long-term intimate witness. Someone who saw the daily rhythm of the marriage at close range, who understood the hierarchy of the household from the servant's perspective, and whose later testimony would provide some of the most revealing details about the life the Windsors actually lived. He saw the Duke's dependency. He saw the Duchess's control. He saw the particular dynamic of a household in which nothing happened without Wallis's approval, and everything revolved around the management of a man who had once commanded the attention of a quarter of the world's population. The war ended. The Bahamas posting ended with it. And the Windsors, freed at last from their tropical banishment, faced the question that would define the rest of their lives. Where would they go and what would they do? Britain was not an option, or at least not a realistic one. The royal family's attitude had not softened during the war years. If anything, it had hardened. George VI had endured 6 years of wartime monarchy, the bombing of Buckingham Palace, the morale visits, the Christmas broadcasts, the relentless public duty that Edward had refused and that was visibly eroding Bertie's health. Elizabeth, the queen consort, had stood beside him through all of it, her resentment of the brother who had caused this transformation, calcifying into something that admitted no revision and no appeal. London was closed to the Windsors in any meaningful sense. They could visit, briefly, grudgingly, for funerals and ceremonial occasions, but they could not live there. The city that had once been Edward's natural home was now a place where he arrived as a guest and departed as a reminder of something the family would rather forget. America was considered. They traveled there frequently and were received with the celebrity treatment that their story still commanded. But America offered no structure, no court, no permanent social world of the kind that two people of their particular needs required. The answer, arrived at gradually through the late 1940s, was Paris. The choice was logical and in its way inevitable. Paris had long been hospitable to exiled royalty, to displaced aristocracy, to the wealthy and the titled who found themselves without a country that would have them. The international social circuit there was forgiving, cosmopolitan, and accustomed to accommodating people whose stories were more complicated than their surfaces suggested. A house of sufficient grandeur could be obtained and staffed and maintained in the style that Wallis required and Edward expected. The French government, which understood the diplomatic value of hosting a former British king, would eventually provide the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne at a nominal rent, a grand, imposing residence surrounded by parkland, large enough for entertaining, private enough for isolation, and comfortable enough to sustain the illusion that exile was a choice rather than a sentence. The Paris household that took shape through the late 1940s and into the 50s became Wallis's masterwork and her prison. She threw herself into its creation with the same intensity she had brought to every environment she had ever controlled. The rooms were decorated with exquisite taste, not the heavy institutional taste of British palaces, but a lighter, more modern aesthetic that reflected Wallis's own sensibility and the best French interior design of the period. The silver was polished. The flowers were arranged daily, precisely, in combination that she personally supervised. The staff were trained to a standard that rivaled the finest private houses in Europe. Dinner parties were orchestrated as performances, every detail, from the placement of guests to the temperature of the wine to the rhythm of service, controlled by Wallis with an attention to detail that struck some visitors as admirable and others as pathological. The Grumble Book, in which unsatisfactory guests were recorded and from which they were unlikely to escape, was a real document and a real instrument of social governance. It told you everything about the household's priorities, that the atmosphere must be perfect, that the performance must never falter, and that anyone who disrupted the carefully maintained surface was to be excluded without sentiment. The question that hangs over this period is whether the perfection was a form of artistry or a form of survival. The answer, almost certainly, is both. Wallis was brilliant at what she did. She was one of the great hostesses of the 20th century, and the life she built in Paris was, on its surface, magnificent. But the magnificence was also a defense against the purposelessness that surrounded it, against the knowledge that all this beauty was in service of nothing larger than itself, against the suffocating reality that her husband had no role, no function, and no emotional resources beyond pure daily presence. The house was perfect because the life inside it could not afford to be examined too closely. They had what the public believed they wanted. They had each other, a title, a fortune, and their freedom from the British crown. What they did not have was a future that either of them had actually chosen. The exile years would not be the romantic reward the fairy tale demanded. They would be a life of displacement, of petty grievance elevated to permanent condition, of social theater performed in houses that were never quite home, and of a marriage in which one partner needed constantly and the other managed constantly, and neither could afford to stop. They had what the public believed they wanted. They had each other, a title, a fortune, and their freedom from the British crown. What they did not have was a future that either of them had actually chosen. The exile years would not be the romantic reward the fairy tale demanded. They would be a life of displacement, of petty grievance elevated to permanent condition, of social theater performed in houses that were never quite home, and of a marriage in which one partner needed constantly and the other managed constantly, and neither could afford to stop. The Paris years settled into their impermanent shape through the 1950s, and the shape was this: a life of extraordinary external elegance, sustained by a marriage that functioned less as a partnership and more as a management system. The Windsors entertained. They dined. They were seen at the right restaurants, at the right houses, at the right seasonal events on the international social circuit. Biarritz in summer, the south of France in autumn, New York for periodic visits, the round of parties and weekends and charity galas that filled the calendar of the wealthy European displaced. From the outside, it looked enviable. Two beautiful houses, the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne and Le Moulin de la Tuileries, a country property at Gif-sur-Yvette that Wallis had converted into a charming weekend retreat, a dedicated staff, an income that permitted comfort bordering on luxury, and the residual glamour of being the most famous love story of the century. From the inside, the picture was different. The Duke of Windsor, stripped of his constitutional function, had nothing to do. That fact, which sounds simple, was in practice devastating. He had been raised for one purpose, to be king, and having rejected that purpose, he had no replacement. He was not a businessman. He was not a writer, though he would eventually produce a memoir. He was not an intellectual, a philanthropist, or a sportsman of sufficient caliber to fill his days. He was a man whose entire identity had been constructed around a role he had abandoned, and without that role, he was, in the most fundamental sense, empty. The emptiness expressed itself as grievance against a family that had cut him off, against a government that had forced his hand, against a system that refused to grant Wallis the title of Her Royal Highness, against a world that had moved on without him. The grievance was constant, repetitive, and exhausting. It was also for Wallis inescapable. She was the only audience for it. She was the only person who could absorb it, manage it, redirect it, and prevent it from consuming the household entirely. Charles Murphy, the American journalist who helped the Duke write his memoir, A King's Story, in the late 1940s and early 50s, left an account of the working process that is comic on the surface and devastating underneath. Murphy describes sessions in which Edward would attempt to focus on the manuscript only to be interrupted repeatedly by Wallis with social reminders, domestic queries, file retrievals, and trivial household matters. The Duke's response every time was the same: a cheerful, "Yes, darling," followed by immediate obedience. He would spring from his chair, attend to whatever she required, and return to the desk as though nothing had happened. Murphy's account is sometimes read as evidence of Wallis's controlling nature. It can equally be read as evidence of something more complex: a woman who had been handed the job of running an ex-king's life, who performed that job with relentless competence, and who had learned over years of practice that the only way to manage Edward was to keep him occupied, directed, and responsive to her instructions at all times. She was not bullying him. She was keeping the system running. And the system, their marriage, their household, their social world, their entire reason for existing, required her constant, exhausting, unrelenting attention. The memoir itself, when it was published in 1951, contributed to the public myth that the Windsors had spent their lives carefully constructing. A King's Story presented the abdication as a noble sacrifice, the exile as a chosen adventure, and the marriage as the triumphant conclusion to the greatest love story of the 20th century. It was elegantly written, carefully edited, and almost entirely misleading. Wallis's own memoir, The Heart Has Its Reasons, published in 1956, maintained the same line with her characteristic poise and wit. Together, the books created a narrative that the public consumed eagerly and that bore almost no resemblance to the private reality of the Paris household. The gap between the published version and the lived version was, by the mid-50s, vast and growing. The second fracture in this story is not a single event. It is the accumulation of consequences from the German visit, the wartime banishment, and the post-war exclusion that, taken together, destroyed the last possibility that the Windsors might be rehabilitated into something resembling a useful public role. The German visit of 1937 had contaminated their name. The wartime exile had confirmed their irrelevance, and the post-war settlement, Paris, nominal rent, a generous income, absolute exclusion from royal duties, had made the terms explicit. They were to be maintained, not reintegrated, sustained, not welcomed. The dynasty's message was clear: you may carry the name, but you may not carry the responsibility. You may live as Windsors, but you may not function as Windsors. The title without the role, the name without the belonging. For Edward, this was experienced as an ongoing wound that never scabbed over. Every royal event he was not invited to, every state occasion he watched from Paris, every newspaper report of his brother's or his niece's public duties reminded him of what he had lost and what had been taken. The distinction between those two, what he had voluntarily surrendered and what the family had subsequently withheld, was one he refused to make. In his telling, he had given up the throne for love, and the family had punished him for it. In the family's telling, he had broken the compact, and the consequences were his to bear. Neither version was entirely wrong. Both were incomplete. And in the space between them, the Windsor's exile hardened from temporary embarrassment into permanent condition. For Wallis, the exclusion produced a different kind of damage. She was not wounded by the loss of a role she had once held, because she had never held one. She was wounded by the knowledge that the sacrifice, the loss of Ernest, the loss of privacy, the loss of the possibility of an ordinary life, had purchased nothing that the world outside the household could see or honor. She was a duchess who was not a royal highness. She was a wife who was not welcome in her husband's family home. She was the most famous woman of her generation, and the fame was inseparable from blame. The perfection of the Paris household, the silver, the flowers, the impeccable dinners, was, in this light, not vanity. It was the only form of status she could manufacture for herself. If the family would not grant her legitimacy, she would build it out of crystal and linen and the silent obedience of a perfectly trained staff. Meanwhile, across the channel, the parallel lives were diverging with increasing clarity. George VI was visibly unwell by the late 1940s. The war had aged him beyond his years. He smoked heavily. His health deteriorated through a series of conditions that culminated in the diagnosis of lung cancer that would kill him in February 1952, at the age of 56. His death in his sleep at Sandringham, while his daughter Elizabeth was in Kenya on a royal tour, was the clearest possible demonstration of the cost the abdication had extracted from the brother who had absorbed its consequences. Whether the crown literally killed George VI is a question that cannot be answered with medical certainty. Whether the crown shortened his life is a question that almost everyone close to him answered in the same way. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, now the Queen Mother, was 51 years old when her husband died. She had been married to him for 29 years, and she believed with a conviction that decades of subsequent life did nothing to soften that Wallis Simpson had killed him, not with malice, but with the chain of consequences that began when an American divorcee captured the attention of a man too weak to resist his own need. Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II on February the 6th, 1952, at the age of 25. She was in Kenya when the news reached her, perched in a treehouse overlooking a watering hole at Treetops Hotel, watching elephants in the African night. By the time she descended, she was queen. The accession was, in constitutional terms, automatic. The crown passes at the moment of the previous sovereign's death, not at the coronation. And the young woman who had spent her childhood absorbing the lesson that duty was everything and personal desire was nothing inherited, not merely a throne, but the family's entire unresolved relationship with the uncle in Paris. The dynamic between Elizabeth and the Windsors would persist for the next 2 decades with a characteristic that was, in its way, the most Windsor trait of all. It was managed through silence rather than confrontation. There were no dramatic scenes, no public ruptures, no letters of denunciation. There was instead a formal correctness, maintained at a distance, occasional visits, the acknowledgement of kinship, the exchange of appropriate pleasantries, combined with the quiet, implacable enforcement of the boundary that the family had drawn in December 1936. Edward was her uncle. He was the man who had bounced her on his knee when she was a child, who had been the glamorous, exciting older relative in a family that did not traffic in excitement. He was also the man whose abdication had made her father king, and whose abdication had, in the family's reckoning, contributed to her father's early death at 56. Those facts coexisted in every interaction between Elizabeth and the Windsors, and the tension between them was never acknowledged, never discussed, and never resolved. It simply persisted, like the hum of an electrical current behind the walls of a house, always present, never addressed, shaping everything without ever being named. The Queen Mother, meanwhile, settled into the role she would occupy for the next 5 decades. The matriarch, the keeper of the family's emotional memory, the woman whose warmth and charm and apparent ease concealed a will that admitted no compromise where the Windsors were concerned. She had loved George VI with a completeness that those who knew them both consistently affirmed. She had watched the crown age him, exhaust him, and finally kill him. And she held Wallis Simpson, not Edward, notably, but Wallis, responsible for that chain of events with a conviction that outlasted governments, generations, and the passing of every other grudge the family carried. Her presence in the background of the story is crucial because it represented the family's emotional verdict on the abdication, not merely that it had been wrong, but that it had been unforgivable, and that the woman at its center was the agent of that unforgivability. Wallis, who understood social dynamics better than almost anyone alive, grasped this. She was, by several accounts, genuinely frightened at the prospect of encountering the Queen Mother. That fear was not neurotic. It was the accurate reading of a situation in which she was and would always remain unforgiven. In Paris, the Windsors aged. The social circuit continued, but the energy behind it was fading. The parties still happened, the dinners were still immaculate, the household still ran with the precision that Wallis demanded. But the purpose, if there had ever been a purpose beyond survival, was draining away. Edward's grievances became more repetitive, more circular, more exhausting. His physical health began to decline through the 1960s. His hip troubled him, his energy diminished, and the emotional dependency that had always been the foundation of the marriage became, in his later years, something that witnesses found difficult to watch without discomfort. Johanna Schutz, who joined the household as private secretary in the late 1960s, provides the most intimate testimony about this final phase of the marriage. Her recollections, shared years later and colored inevitably by personal loyalty and the distortions of retrospect, describe a dynamic that was by then completely fixed, as rigid and unyielding as the placement of the silver on the dining table. When Wallis went out to a lunch, a fitting at Givenchy, a social engagement with friends, the Duke would stand at the door and tell her how much he would miss her. His voice, by Schutz's description, carried the particular plaintiveness of someone for whom even a temporary absence registered as abandonment. When Wallis returned, he would be waiting, often in the same spot, sometimes with the dogs at his feet, greeting her with an extravagance of relief that suggested she had been gone for months rather than hours. He tracked her movements through the house. He wanted to know where she was, what she was doing, when she would be in the room with him again. His world had contracted over the decades to a single point. Wallis's physical presence, everything outside that presence, the house, the staff, the social world, the vestiges of his former position, the news from England, the progress of the monarchy he had once headed, was peripheral. She was the only thing that was real to him. The man who had once been king emperor now lived entirely within the radius of one woman's daily movements through a house in the Bois de Boulogne. Schutz's account of this dependency is tender in places and horrifying in others. The tenderness is in the old man's devotion, genuine, total, unwavering, and in its way deeply moving. He loved her. That much was never in doubt, not to Schutz, not to anyone who observed them. Whatever else the marriage was, a management system, a prison, a monument to a catastrophic decision, it was also a love story, and the love, at least on his side, was real and undying and absolute. The horror is in what it required of Wallis, and in the recognition, visible to Schutz and to others who saw the household from the inside, that the love's absoluteness was itself the problem. She was in her 70s. She had spent more than 3 decades as the emotional center of gravity for a man who could not function without her. She had managed his schedule, his correspondence, his social life, his wardrobe, his moods, his medical appointments, his grievances, and his daily existence with a competence that never visibly faltered, not through the Bahamas, not through the post-war rootlessness, not through the decades of Paris exile, not through the repetitive cycles of his bitterness and need. And she was, by Schutz's account, exhausted by it. Not merely tired, but exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that people become exhausted when the task they are performing has no end point, no relief, no possibility of delegation. and no recognition beyond the walls of the house in which it takes place. Schutz's most devastating contribution to the historical record is a single line, delivered with the matter of factness of someone stating what she considered obvious. He trapped her, no question. That formulation reverses the entire public narrative. In the world's version, Wallis trapped Edward, seduced him, manipulated him, pulled him away from his duty and his family. In Schutz's version, it was Edward who trapped Wallis, not through malice, but through the sheer, ungovernable force of his need. He made himself so dependent on her that leaving was unthinkable, so attached that any attempt to create distance would have felt like cruelty, so entirely the center of her daily responsibility that she could not have extricated herself without dismantling the only life she had. She had not signed up for this. She had signed up for a king's attention, for excitement, for social elevation, perhaps for escape from a marriage that had become too comfortable and too small. She had received instead a lifetime of emotional labor from which there was no resignation, no retirement, and no end short of death. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who are surrounded by company, but cut off from belonging. And the Windsors in Paris embodied it with a precision that would have been poetic if it had not been so bleak. They were never alone. The household was staffed. The calendar was full. The guest list included some of the most prominent names in European society: diplomats, aristocrats, fashion designers, writers, the international set that moved between Paris, New York, Palm Beach, and the Riviera. Was this seasonal regularity of migratory birds, but none of it constituted connection in the sense that either of them, in their different ways, needed. Edward needed the validation of a role, and the social circuit could not provide it. Wallis needed the acknowledgement that her sacrifice had purchased something of value, and the world, polite to her face, dismissive behind her back, fascinated by her but never fully respectful of her, could not provide that either. The villa itself, at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, became the physical expression of this paradox. It was large, handsome, set in grounds that offered privacy and a sense of estate-like grandeur unusual for Paris. The French government's offer of the property at nominal rent was a gesture of diplomatic courtesy, a way of keeping a former British king comfortable on French soil, with all the soft political advantages that entailed. The Windsors occupied it from the late 1950s, and Wallis set about transforming it into a showcase that rivaled, and in some respects surpassed, the great private houses of the city. The interiors were exquisite. The trompe-l'oeil paintings in the entrance hall, the 18th century furniture, the arrangement of personal photographs, including prominently images from the Duke's royal past, created an environment that was simultaneously a museum, embassy, and domestic stage set. It was a house designed to project a particular version of life, ordered, beautiful, significant, the home of people who mattered. The effort required to maintain that projection was immense, and it was almost entirely Wallis's. Architectural Digest documentation of the house, published with Wallis's cooperation, reveals the degree to which domestic management had become the central activity of her life. The flowers were changed daily and arranged according to a strict aesthetic code. The silver was polished to a standard that the staff understood was non-negotiable. The menus for dinner parties were planned weeks in advance, each course selected not merely for flavor, but for visual presentation, for the way the dishes would complement the china, the table linen, the candles. Guests were seated according to a calculus that took into account social rank, conversational compatibility, previous visits, and the likelihood of generating the kind of atmosphere that Wallis considered acceptable. Those who failed to meet this standard were noted in the Grumble Book, the household's private ledger of social judgment, and their chances of return diminished accordingly. The system was, by any standard, extraordinary. It was also the system of a woman who had nothing else to govern. The Duke, in this world, was both the ostensible center and the managed object. His daily routine was structured by Wallis. His correspondence was managed by the secretary. His social engagements were chosen by his wife. His wardrobe, famously sharp, famously stylish, a last remnant of the glamour that had once defined him, was supervised by Wallis with the same attention she devoted to the dinner table. He accepted all of it. He accepted it cheerfully, even eagerly. because acceptance meant proximity to the person he could not be without, and because the alternative, asserting his own preferences, choosing his own schedule, making decisions without her involvement, was something he appeared to have no desire or capacity to do. The Prince of Wales, who had once charmed the empire, was now a man who asked his wife's permission to leave a room. The question of what the marriage had actually become by the 1960s is one that the available evidence answers differently depending on whose testimony you privilege. Visitors who saw the couple socially often described them as devoted, affectionate, and genuinely happy. A pair who had paid a high price for their love and had made the best of it. Staff who lived inside the household described something more complicated. A relationship in which devotion and dependency were so intertwined that separating them was impossible, in which the Duke's emotional need was so total that it consumed the air in every room, and in which Wallis's management of that need had become so habitual, so ingrained, so entirely the structure of her daily existence that she could no longer imagine life without it, even as it exhausted her. Both descriptions were probably true. The same marriage can look like love from the dining room and like suffocation from the kitchen. The divergence between the Windsor's Paris existence and the life of the British monarchy across the Channel became sharper with each passing year. George VI was dead. Elizabeth II was on the throne, and her reign was being defined by exactly the qualities that Edward had lacked: discipline, consistency, emotional restraint, the willingness to subordinate personal desire to institutional obligation. The contrast was not lost on anyone, least of all on the Windsors themselves. Every time the Queen appeared on television, every time a state visit was reported, every time the court circular published the details of the royal family's public engagements, it was a reminder of the world Edward had left and the world that had continued successfully without him. The monarchy had not collapsed after the abdication, as some had predicted. It had adapted, strengthened, and under Elizabeth, become more stable and more popular than it had been in decades. Edward's sacrifice had not destroyed the institution. It had merely removed him from it. The effect on Edward was corrosive. His grievance, already the dominant note of his emotional life, deepened as the years passed. He complained about the family. He complained about the title withheld from Wallis. He complained about the money, though the money was ample. He complained about the lack of recognition, though what form he imagined that recognition might take was never entirely clear. He wanted, it seems, to be told that what he had done was right, that the abdication had been noble, that the sacrifice had been understood, that the family owed him gratitude rather than exclusion, that validation never came, and without it the grievance fed on itself, growing more bitter and more repetitive with each passing year, until it became the background hum of the household, constant, unresolvable, and inescapable for the woman who lived with it. Wallis absorbed the grievance the way she absorbed everything. She managed it. She redirected conversations when Edward's complaints became too circular. She planned social events that distracted him. She maintained the household's immaculate surface as a bulwark against the chaos of his emotional interior. But the cost was cumulative, and by the 1960s it was becoming visible to those who knew her well. She was thinner. Her famous sharpness had an edge of weariness. Her wit, which had once been her most celebrated quality, had acquired a brittleness that suggested it was being deployed defensively rather than for pleasure. She was, by the accounts of those closest to her, a woman running on discipline and habit, sustained by the same qualities that had carried her through a precarious Baltimore childhood and two bad marriages: the ability to control what could be controlled, to manage what could be managed, and to endure what could only be endured. The Duke's health began to decline in earnest through the late 1960s. His hip was bad and worsening. His energy, once sufficient for the social circuit and the long dinners and the weekends at Le Moulin, was diminished to a point where the household's rhythms had to be adjusted around his capacity. He was, by Schutz's account, increasingly fragile. Not merely physically, but in the way he held himself, the way he moved through the rooms of the house that bore the weight of 3 decades' worth of accumulated exile, the way he looked at Wallis with an expression that combined adoration and helplessness in equal measure. The Golden Prince was gone. The reckless king was gone. The petulant ex-monarch of the Bahamas years and the restless socialite of the 50s were gone. What remained was an old man with a bad hip and a fading body and an attachment to his wife that had passed through adoration, through dependency, through something that looked from the outside like the relationship between a patient and his full-time carer, and arrived at a place that defied easy characterization, but that everyone who witnessed it recognized as absolute. He loved her, he needed her, he could not function without her. He could barely imagine the world in her absence. And she, the woman from Baltimore who had been blamed for the fall of a king, who had been cast as the villainess of the century's greatest love story, who had spent more than 30 years managing the consequences of a decision she had never wanted and could not undo, kept the house running, kept the flowers fresh, kept the dinners as immaculate as the Duke's declining health permitted, and waited for what was coming with the composure of someone who had long since stopped believing in rescue or reprieve. The system she had built was the only thing standing between the household and collapse. And the system's central component, the man it had been built to sustain, the man whose need had created the system in the first place, was dying. By the early 1970s, the end was approaching with a certainty that the household could feel in every adjusted schedule, every canceled engagement, every evening that ended earlier than the one before. The Duke of Windsor was 77 years old, and the body that had once carried the hopes of an empire was failing. Throat cancer was diagnosed, the treatments were grueling. The Paris house, which had been built as a theater of elegance and control, was becoming by degrees a sick room. And in the midst of this slow diminishment, history arranged a final scene of such dynastic density that no dramatist could have improved upon it. Queen Elizabeth II was coming to Paris on a state visit, and she would visit her dying uncle at the house in the Bois de Boulogne. The niece whose life had been rerouted by December 1936 was about to stand at the bedside of the man who had rerouted it in the house his wife had built, as a monument to everything the abdication had cost them both. The household had become perfectly ordered, but only because the marriage had become a system of total dependence. The great romantic exile now looked less like freedom and more like a life that Wallis had to keep functioning every hour of every day. She had built a magnificent cage, and she lived inside it with the man whose love had made the cage necessary. And now the man who had made the cage, who had made everything, who had given up an empire so that he would never have to be without her, was beginning to fail. His body was giving out. His mind was intact, but his energy was gone. The system she had spent 3 decades maintaining was about to lose the person it had been built to sustain. And what came after that, what happened to Wallis when the center of her world was removed, would be the darkest chapter of the entire story. The final phase of the Duke of Windsor's life unfolded inside the same house that had been his exile stage set for nearly 2 decades. By the early 1970s, the throat cancer that had been diagnosed was progressing, and the treatments, radiation therapy administered in Paris, were taking a visible toll on a man who had already been diminished by years of declining health. The household adjusted around his condition with the meticulous efficiency that Wallis had always demanded from her staff, but the adjustments were now medical rather than social. Doctors came and went. Nurses attended. The dinners that had once been the centerpiece of the household's calendar were scaled back, then curtailed, then abandoned altogether as the Duke's capacity for the social performance that Wallis had built their world around diminished to nothing. The house that had been designed to project elegance and significance was becoming room by room the setting for an extended dying. It was in this context that the Queen's visit occurred, and the scene was thick with everything the House of Windsor had spent decades refusing to acknowledge openly. Elizabeth arrived at the Villa Windsor during a state visit to France, a visit planned for diplomatic purposes, around which the private family reckoning had been carefully, almost surgically arranged. She came with Prince Philip and Prince Charles. The timing was not accidental. The Duke was gravely ill. Everyone who knew the situation understood that this was likely the last time the sovereign would see the uncle who had made her sovereignty possible. The visit was, depending on how you chose to read it, an act of reconciliation, an act of duty, an act of theater, or all three simultaneously. The house would have been as Wallis always kept it, Immaculate, ordered, the flowers in place, the staff attentive, the surfaces polished to the standard that had been maintained through 3 decades of exile. But the surface, for once, could not conceal what was underneath. The Duke was dying. He was too ill to come downstairs. The Queen and her husband and her son went up to see him. The exact details of what was said in that room have never been made fully public, and the private accounts that exist are filtered through the reticence that both sides maintained about the encounter. What is known is that the Queen saw her uncle, that the meeting was brief, and that the Duke, despite his condition, was reportedly determined to show that he could still manage the basic courtesies. The image is almost unbearable in its condensation of the entire story. The niece who had spent her life inside the code her grandfather built, visiting the uncle who had broken the code, in the house that his wife had built as a substitute for everything the code had taken away. Wallis received the Queen downstairs. By several accounts, she was anxious, uncertain of the protocol that governed a visit from the sovereign to a house that was royal by association, but not by official standing. The denial of the title Her Royal Highness, which had wounded her for 35 years, was present in every curtsy, every form of address, every small calibration of precedence that the visit required. She was the hostess. She was also in the family's taxonomy something less than a full member, a duchess without the highest rank, a wife without the complete status, a woman who had lived with the most famous man in the family for 35 years and was still, in some essential and unalterable way, an outsider. Prince Charles, who accompanied his mother and father, was 23 years old. He was in the family's generational architecture, the next link in the chain that the abdication had forged, the grandson of the brother who had absorbed the crown, the son of the niece who had inherited it, and the heir to a throne that existed in its current form because of what had happened in December 1936. His presence at the Villa Windsor was a reminder that the abdication's consequences did not end with any single generation. They compounded, they passed forward. The cost of Edward's choice would be borne not only by his brother and his niece, but by every subsequent occupant of the throne, each of whom would inherit an institution whose modern identity was shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, by the moment one man decided he could not bear the code. The visit lasted perhaps 30 minutes. It could not have lasted longer given the Duke's condition and the constraints of the state visit schedule. But those 30 minutes contained in compressed form the entire weight of the dynasty's 20th century history. The grandfather who built the code, the son who broke it, the brother who bore the consequences, the niece who inherited the result, and the American outsider who had been at the center of it all, now standing in her own drawing room, trying to navigate the protocol of a visit from the woman who occupied the throne. Her husband had abandoned. The Queen left. The motorcade departed, and the Villa Windsor returned to the silence of a house where a man was dying. The days between the Queen's visit and the Duke's death were few. Edward, Duke of Windsor, died at the Villa Windsor on May the 28th, 1972. He was 77 years old. He died in the house where the myth of his romantic exile had been curated most carefully, not in Britain, not in a palace, not at Sandringham or Windsor Castle, where the Windsors who had kept the code were born and died, but in a rented Parisian mansion in the Bois de Boulogne, surrounded by the objects his wife had chosen and the atmosphere she had spent a lifetime creating. The room in which he died was inside the same house in which the Grumble book sat, in which the silver gleamed, in which the flowers stood in their daily arrangements, as though nothing in the world had changed. He had been born in the reign of his great-grandmother Victoria, in a world of empire and certainty and unquestioned hierarchy that was by 1972 as remote as the Middle Ages. He had been prince, king, duke, exile, and in his final years, patient. The trajectory was among the strangest any member of the British royal family had ever traced. From the most celebrated heir in the history of the empire, the man who had drawn crowds on every continent and been worshipped by a public that saw in him the promise of a modern human monarchy, to an old man dying in a rented house in France, attended by the woman who had been the cause, the consequence, and the daily administrator of his extraordinary and terrible choice. The 77 years of his life contain, if you compress them to their essence, a single arc. A man who was given everything the world could offer, a title, wealth, adoration, power, the most famous position on earth. and who discovered that none of it was sufficient to compensate for the one thing he could not provide for himself: emotional stability. He had sought that stability from women his entire adult life. He had found it, or believed he had found it, in Wallis. And the finding had cost him his crown, his country, his family's acceptance, and, in the view of those who watched the marriage from inside the household, his wife's freedom. He died having never acknowledged, so far as the available evidence shows, that the price had been too high. In his understanding, the sacrifice had been noble and the love had been real. The alternative reading, that the sacrifice had been compulsive and the love had been a form of need so extreme that it consumed everyone within its radius, was not one he was equipped to entertain. The death itself, as a physical event, was quiet. It was not dramatic. There was no last-minute reconciliation with the family that remained in England. There was no grand speech, no reversal, no final gesture that resolved the contradictions of a life lived between two incompatible truths: that he had loved deeply and selfishly, that he had been brave and reckless, that his sacrifice had been genuine, and his understanding of its consequences almost childishly incomplete. He simply died in the house in Paris, with Wallis somewhere in the rooms that she had spent 35 years arranging into a world she could control. There is something about this setting that is worth sitting with. The Villa Windsor, on the day of Edward's death, would have looked exactly as it looked on every other day, the product of Wallis's relentless and unending campaign to hold the physical world to a standard that admitted no slippage, no disorder, no visible evidence that the life inside the house was anything other than serene and beautiful and intentional. The flowers were arranged, the surfaces gleamed. The household staff moved through their routines with the training that decades of Wallis's supervision had instilled. And somewhere in the upstairs rooms, a man who had once worn the crown of England was dying, and the machinery of the household continued to function around his dying with the same impersonal precision that it brought to everything else. The contrast, like the perfection of the setting and the helplessness of the event, was the marriage's final and most eloquent statement about itself. You could control every flower in every vase. You could polish every piece of silver until it hurt to look at. You could train a staff and curate a guest list and maintain a wardrobe and regulate an atmosphere. And none of it, not one piece of it, could prevent the thing that was happening from happening. The surfaces were irrelevant. They had always been irrelevant. And the woman who had made them the center of her life was about to discover that the center could not hold. What his death exposed was the structure that had been hidden beneath the surface of the marriage for decades. Without Edward, Wallis was not liberated into peace. She was not freed from the burden of managing him. She was, instead, suddenly and catastrophically without the role that had defined her entire adult life since 1937. She had been a wife, a manager, a scheduler, a hostess, an emotional regulator, a social director, and the sole audience for a man's inexhaustible need. Now the need was gone. The man was gone. And what remained was a 75-year-old woman in a large house in a foreign country, holding a title that carried no official standing, connected to a family that had never accepted her, and surrounded by a fortune, an archive, and a household that were suddenly, glaringly purposeless. The immediate aftermath was handled with the controlled formality that the British royal family brought to all occasions involving death and dynasty. The Duke's body was flown to England. Wallis traveled to London for the funeral. She stayed at Buckingham Palace, the first time she had slept under the same roof as the sovereign since before the abdication. The gesture was the Queen's, and it was, by the standards of the family's previous treatment of Wallis, generous. Whether it represented genuine reconciliation, diplomatic courtesy, or the fulfillment of an obligation that the Queen felt toward the memory of her uncle is impossible to determine from the outside. What is visible in the photographs and the reports from those days is a woman who looked diminished, thin, anxious, navigating a world of royal protocol that she understood intellectually, but had never been fully admitted to emotionally. The Duke's body lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and the public was permitted to file past a final acknowledgement of the man's former status, a gesture that recognized that whatever he had done, he had once been king. Tens of thousands came. The British public, which had been told in 1936 that Edward had abandoned them for an American divorcee, and which had spent the intervening decades consuming the romantic version of the story through memoirs and magazine profiles and the persistent cultural mythology of the love that conquered a crown, came to see the coffin of the man who had chosen love over duty. Whether they came out of genuine mourning, curiosity, or the strange magnetism that royal scandal exerts on the national imagination is impossible to say. All three, probably. The British relationship with the abdication had always been complicated. A mixture of disapproval, sympathy, fascination, and the unspoken awareness that the story touched something deep in the culture's understanding of duty, desire, and the cost of living inside institutions that demand the suppression of the self. The funeral took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. It was a royal funeral in form, though not in the full ceremonial weight that would have attended the death of a reigning monarch. The Queen was present. The Queen Mother was present. The woman whose fury at Wallis had been a fixed point of the family constellation for 36 years, now standing in the same chapel as the woman she held responsible for her husband's destruction. The encounter between Wallis and the Queen Mother, brief and governed by the rigid courtesies of the occasion, was observed by those present with the intensity of people watching two opposing forces pass within feet of each other without collision. What Wallis felt in that moment, the standing in the chapel of the castle, whose name her husband had carried into exile, surrounded by the family that had never fully accepted her, saying goodbye to the man whose need had consumed her life, is not recorded in any account that can be considered reliable. Wallis was not a woman who disclosed her emotions publicly, and the accounts of her demeanor at the funeral come from observers who were watching her with the intense, slightly predatory curiosity that the British public had directed at her for 36 years. What is recorded is that she looked frail, bewildered, and very much alone. She was 75 years old. She was burying her husband in a country she had been excluded from, in a chapel belonging to a family that had denied her their highest title, surrounded by people whose relationship to her ranged from formal courtesy to outright hostility. And she was doing it in full public view, which meant that her grief, whatever form it took, whatever she actually felt about the man she had managed for 35 years, it was not private. It was observed, photographed, analyzed, and judged, just as every aspect of her life had been observed and analyzed and judged since the day the British press broke its silence in 1936. There was a reception at Buckingham Palace after the funeral. Wallis attended, the Queen was present, the Queen Mother was present, Philip was present, Charles was present. The family closed around the occasion with the particular and well-practiced combination of courtesy and distance that was its signature response to situations it could not avoid and would not fully embrace. Wallis was inside the palace, but she was not inside the family. She was a guest at her husband's funeral reception, hosted by relatives who had spent 36 years calibrating the exact degree of closeness they were prepared to permit, and who were not, even in the presence of death, inclined to recalibrate. After the funeral, Wallis returned to Paris. The flight back, the car from the airport, the arrival at the house in the Bois de Boulogne. Each stage of the journey was a step back into a world that had lost its animating purpose. The house was waiting, the staff were waiting, the flowers, presumably, were in their places. The silver was polished. The furniture stood in the arrangements Wallis had chosen. Everything was exactly as she had left it, and everything was entirely different, because the person around whom the entire household had been organized for 35 years was no longer in it. Sidney Johnson, the valet who had served the Duke for nearly 30 years, was present in the household during this period, witnessing the transition from a house organized around a living man to a house organized around his absence. Johnson's own story, a young Bahamian who had entered the Windsor's service during the war, who had traveled with them to Paris, who had seen the marriage from the angle that only a personal servant sees, was itself a thread in the larger narrative of the Windsor's exile. He had given 3 decades of his working life to a couple who had relied on him daily, and his future in the household after the Duke's death was uncertain, contingent on the decisions of a widow who was herself increasingly uncertain about everything. The emptiness was not merely emotional, it was structural. Wallis had spent more than 3 decades building and maintaining a system whose primary function was the management of one man's needs. The schedules, the social calendar, the dinner parties, the guest lists, the daily rhythm of domestic life, all of it had been oriented around the Duke. Without him, the system had no object. The machine was running, but the purpose it served had vanished. The house was still immaculate, the flowers were still fresh, and the woman who had kept it all in motion was standing in the middle of it with nothing left to manage except the growing awareness that the life she had built was, in its deepest structure, inseparable from the man who had made it necessary, and that without him it was not a life at all. It was a set, and the performance was over. Time magazine later reported a detail that belongs near the center of any account of Wallis's widowhood, that she kept paper clips and fresh ink on the desk from which the abdication speech had been made, as though the Duke might return to use it. Whether one reads that as love or habit or guilt, or the inability to accept a loss that would have meant accepting the futility of everything she had endured, it is a detail of remarkable power. The desk, the ink, the clips. The room maintained for a man who would never enter it again. It was the domestic equivalent of the grumble book, an instrument of control applied to a reality that could no longer be controlled. The weeks and months that followed the Duke's death were the period in which the story should have ended. The romantic narrative demanded it, the public expected it, and the biographical logic of a marriage that had defined both their lives seemed to require that the final chapter be one of dignified private grief. But the story did not end. It took a turn that was, in some ways, more disturbing than anything that had preceded it, because it revealed that the pattern at the heart of the Windsor's life, the pattern of dependency, of management, of one person's needs being administered by another, that was not unique to the marriage. It was transferable. And the person onto whom it was about to be transferred was not a husband or a lover, but a lawyer. Suzanne Bloom entered the story at the precise moment when Wallis was most vulnerable. And the entering deserves careful attention because it marks the point at which the story's central pattern, one person's life administered by another, reasserted itself in its most disturbing form. Bloom was a prominent Parisian advocate, a woman of formidable reputation in the legal world of the French capital. She was well connected, experienced in the complex legal and financial affairs of the international wealthy, and possessed of a personal forcefulness that those who encountered her described with remarkable consistency as simultaneously impressive and frightening. She was not a woman who invited contradiction. She was not a woman who tolerated interference in matters she had claimed as her own. She had handled aspects of the Windsor's legal affairs for some years before the Duke's death, operating at the margins of their world, visible to the household but not central to it. It was after May 1972, when the Duke's death left Wallis alone and the question of who would manage the Duchess's affairs became urgent, that Bloom moved from the periphery to the center with a speed and decisiveness that startled those who witnessed it. The transition happened gradually at first, and then, by the accounts of those who were affected, with accelerating force. Bloom assumed control of the legal and financial decisions. She assumed authority over the household's operations. She assumed, in practice, if not in formal title, the role of gatekeeper, determining who could see Wallis, under what conditions, and for how long. The justification she offered, to the extent that she offered any, was protective. The Duchess was aging, her health was declining, and she needed to be shielded from the opportunists, the curiosity seekers, and the self-interested parties who would inevitably circle. A wealthy, famous, and increasingly incapacitated woman, the framing was not implausible. Wallis was wealthy. Her name was famous. Her archive was historically significant. There were legitimate reasons to manage access to her and to her affairs with care. But the accounts of what happened under Bloom's management, which come primarily from people who were pushed out of Wallis's life during this period, Johanna Schutz, long-standing friends, members of the household staff who had served the couple for years or decades, paint a picture that goes far beyond careful management. They are inevitably partial and adversarial accounts, shaped by the bitterness of exclusion and the conviction that an injustice had been committed. Bloom's own perspective, to the extent that it was ever articulated publicly, maintained that her actions were in the Duchess's best interest. The counter-narrative, advanced by Schutz and by others who had known Wallis intimately and who found themselves unable to reach her, is far darker and far more disturbing. In their telling, Bloom did not protect Wallis. She captured her. The accounts are disturbing and must be handled with care because they come from people who were adversely affected by Bloom's actions and who had every reason to present their experience in the darkest possible terms. But the pattern they describe, even allowing for bias, is consistent across multiple sources, and it paints a picture that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The pattern was systematic. Visitors were blocked. Friends who had been part of Wallace's social world for decades found that their calls were not returned, their letters were not answered, and their attempts to visit the Villa Windsor were refused. The household staff were reduced and replaced. The intimate circle that had surrounded Wallis, the people who knew her, who understood her, who might have advocated for her interests, was progressively dismantled. Schutz herself was eventually excluded, leaving the household under conditions she described as forced. Sidney Johnson, the valet who had served the Windsors for 3 decades, was gone, driven out by his account because Wallis had refused the flexibility he needed to care for his own children. One by one, the people who constituted the private world of the Villa Windsor were removed, and in their place stood Bloom, increasingly alone, increasingly powerful, increasingly the sole arbiter of what happened inside the house and to the woman who lived in it. The treasures of the house, the jewelry, the paintings, the personal possessions that Wallis had accumulated over decades were by some accounts disappearing. Items were sold or disposed of without clear authorization from Wallis herself. The archive, letters, photographs, documents from the Duke's life and from the marriage, was controlled by Bloom, and in the view of those who had been excluded, treated less as a historical record belonging to the Duchess than as an asset belonging to whoever held the legal authority to dispose of it. The house that Wallis had built as a monument to order and taste was, if these accounts are accurate, being quietly dismantled around her while she sat inside it, too frail and too isolated to know or to object. Whether Wallis understood what was happening is one of the most distressing questions in the entire story, and the answer depends on when you are asking. In the months immediately after the Duke's death, she was alert, if grieving. Over the years that followed, her health and her mental capacity declined. By the late 1970s and into the 80s, she was, by all accounts, severely diminished, unable to receive visitors coherently, unable to manage her own affairs, unable to challenge whatever decisions were being made on her behalf. The house that she had built as a fortress of control was now a place where she had no control at all. The woman who had spent her life governing every detail of her environment, the flowers, the silver, the placement of every guest at every table, was now, if the testimony of those who were excluded is to be believed, a captive in her own home, attended by nurses and staff she had not chosen, isolated from everyone who might have intervened, and presided over by a lawyer whose interests may or may not have aligned with her own. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, was 75 years old. She was alone in Paris. She was grieving, though whether for the man himself or for the role she had lost or for the life that had consumed her is a question that perhaps does not admit of a single answer. She had no children. She had no family in the country where she lived. The family whose name she carried had tolerated her presence at the funeral and then, with immaculate courtesy, returned her to her exile. And around her, circling with increasing proximity, was the woman who would determine the final chapter of her life. The lawyer who had moved from the periphery of the Windsor's affairs to something very close to its center, and whose intentions, however they were later characterized, would produce an outcome that constituted the story's last and most disturbing act of control. The ex-king was dead. The woman who had been blamed for his fall, who had managed his exile, who had built a magnificent and purposeless life around his bottomless need, was now the sole occupant of that life. And the final horror of the story, the thing the public myth of the greatest love story of the 20th century could never have anticipated, was that the woman at its center was about to lose not only her husband, but the last practical control she had ever possessed over her own existence. The captivity that had begun with the king's love, impulsive, overwhelming, total, and utterly indifferent to the cost it imposed on the person who received it, was about to be completed by a lawyer's authority. And the world, which had never understood the first captivity because it had been disguised as the greatest romance of the century, would not learn of the second until it was far too late for anyone to intervene. The years between the Duke's death in 1972 and Wallis's own death in 1986 constitute the final act of a story that had long since ceased to resemble the romance the world believed it to be. They are the years that the myth does not cover, the years that the memoirs did not anticipate, the years that no dramatization fully captured until the 21st century forced a reassessment that the 20th had been reluctant to undertake. For 14 years, nearly a decade and a half, longer than the Bahamas posting and the post-war wandering combined, the Duchess of Windsor lived in the house in the Bois de Boulogne. The same house, the same rooms, the same surfaces she had spent decades polishing into submission, the same corridors through which the Duke had once followed her, with the anxious devotion of a man who could not bear to let her out of his sight. And the life she lived there during those years was, by every credible account that has emerged from the people who witnessed it or who tried and failed to witness it, a slow and terrible diminishment of her faculties, of her agency, of her connection to the world she had spent her life managing, and finally of her very identity as a person capable of governing her own existence. The pattern of isolation that Suzanne Bloom established in the months after the Duke's death deepened steadily through the 1970s. The friends who had constituted Wallis's social world, the dinner guests, the weekend visitors, the international figures who had moved through the Villa Windsor for decades, found that access to the Duchess was increasingly controlled, increasingly restricted, and increasingly impossible. Telephone calls were screened. Letters went unanswered. Requests for visits were declined on the grounds that the Duchess was unwell, or resting, or not receiving callers. The social circle that had been the structure of Wallis's Paris existence contracted until it consisted, in practical terms, of the household staff, the medical attendants, and Blum herself. The woman who had curated guest lists with the precision of a military strategist was now living in a house where the guest list had been reduced to zero by someone else's decision. Johanna Schutz, the private secretary who had witnessed the final phase of the marriage from inside the household, was among those who were excluded during this period. Her departure from the Villa Windsor was, by her account, not voluntary. It was engineered, part of the systematic clearing out of anyone who had been close enough to the Duchess to form an independent view of her situation. The details of the separation are contested, as are most details involving Bloom's management of the Duchess's affairs. What Schutz has described is the experience of being progressively marginalized within a household where she had once been trusted, and then being removed entirely from the life of a woman she had served during the most intimate years of the marriage. The exclusion stung, and it radicalized Schutz's account of what was happening at the Villa Windsor. Whether Bloom was genuinely shielding the Duchess from exploitation, or whether she was exploiting the Duchess herself, became, for Schutz and for others who were pushed out, the defining question of the story's final chapter. Schutz would later share her recollections publicly of the marriage's emotional architecture, of the Duke's dependency and Wallis's exhaustion, of the household's daily rhythms, and of the conditions under which the Duchess spent her final years. Those recollections, filtered through the distortions of time, personal loyalty, and the anger of someone who had been denied access to a woman she cared about, would become a central part of the modern reassessment of the Windsor story. They are not neutral testimony. They are the testimony of a witness who was removed from the scene and who believes, with visible conviction, that the removal was unjust and that what happened after it was worse. Sidney Johnson, the Bahamian valet who had served the Duke for nearly 3 decades, had already departed the household before the worst of Bloom's regime took hold. His departure was its own small tragedy within the larger one, a story that nobody outside the household would have noticed, but that contained in miniature everything the Windsor story was about. Loyalty extracted, service given, and the human cost of maintaining a world that existed for the comfort of the people at its center. Johnson had entered the Windsor's service as a young man in Nassau during the war years. He had given the most productive decades of his working life to the couple's daily needs. He had ironed the Duke's shirts and laid out his clothes and attended to the intimate personal details that a valet attends to. And he had done so across 3 decades, across multiple countries, through the changes of season and address and fortune that the exile produced. He had witnessed the marriage from a vantage point that no biographer could replicate. not from the drawing room where the guests were entertained, but from the servants' quarters where the reality was not disguised. He knew the rhythms of the Duke's dependents. He knew the patterns of the Duchess's management. He understood the household's impeccable surface and the strains that ran beneath it. And when the time came for his own needs to be accommodated, the need specifically for some flexibility in his working arrangements to allow him to care for his own children, to attend to his own family, to acknowledge that his life outside the Villa Windsor had claims on him, that 30 years of service did not erase. The household could not or would not adjust. The system that Wallis had built was a system of absolute standards, and absolute standards do not bend. Johnson left. The departure was not dramatic. It was not a confrontation or a scandal. It was the quiet, devastating exit of a man who had given 3 decades to a household that could not, in the end, give him an afternoon. It tells you everything you need to know about the world the Windsors had constructed. The staff existed to serve the system, and the system did not serve the staff. And when the two came into conflict, it was always the person, never the system, who was expected to yield. After Johnson's departure and Schutz's exclusion, the household entered its final configuration. Stripped of the people who had known Wallis longest, purged of the relationships that might have constituted a check on whatever was happening inside the house. What remained was Wallis herself, the medical attendants who cared for her physical needs, the domestic staff operating under Bloom's direction, and Bloom, the lawyer who visited the house, with a regularity and an authority that those who had been excluded likened, not always hyperbolically, to a governor inspecting an institution over which she held absolute jurisdiction. Whether that characterization is fair to Bloom is a question the available evidence cannot definitively answer, and the script should not pretend otherwise. There are 2 versions of the story, and they are, in their essential claims, almost irreconcilable. In one version, Bloom's version, to the extent that it was ever articulated, she was a loyal and protective advocate for an aging, increasingly incapacitated woman who was vulnerable to exploitation by precisely the kind of people who had always orbited the Windsor name: the journalists seeking access, the curiosity seekers wanting a glimpse, the would-be biographers angling for material, the social climbers hoping to attach themselves to the residual glamour, the dealers and collectors who understood the financial value of what the house contained. In this version, the isolation was necessary. The exclusion of former staff and friends was protective, and Bloom's authority was exercised in the Duchess's interest. In the other version, the version advanced by Schutz, by former friends, by those who tried and failed to reach Wallis during her final years, Bloom was not the protector, but the captor, the person who used her legal authority over the Duchess's affairs to consolidate her own power, to control access to the Windsor archive and fortune, to dispose of possessions under conditions that no one outside her authority could scrutinize, and to maintain dominion over a woman who was too diminished, too isolated, and too far removed from anyone who might have intervened to resist or even to understand what was being done in her name. The truth, as is usually the case in situations where power is concentrated and accountability is absent, probably contain elements of both. Bloom may have been genuinely protective and genuinely self-interested, genuinely concerned for Wallis's welfare, and genuinely determined to maintain her own position. The 2 are not mutually exclusive. What is beyond reasonable dispute is the outcome, the specific, documented, visible consequence of Bloom's management of the Duchess's affairs. Wallis spent the last decade and more of her life in conditions that bore no resemblance to anything she had known before, isolated from everyone who had once constituted her world, governed by someone she had not chosen, and reduced to a state of dependency so complete that it made the Duke's emotional reliance on her look, in retrospect, like a mild inconvenience. The possessions that had defined the Paris household, the material evidence of 3 decades of Wallis's obsessive curation, the objects that constituted the physical residue of the Windsor exile, began to disperse. Items from the house, including paintings, decorative objects, and personal effects that Wallis had selected with the precision that characterized everything she did, were sold or removed under circumstances that those outside Bloom's control could not verify or challenge. The process was opaque. The details were unavailable. The people who might have questioned what was happening, the friends, the former staff, the people who had known Wallis and who understood the value, both sentimental and financial, of the objects in her care, were precisely the people who had been excluded from the house. The household that Wallis had built as a monument to control was being dismantled, item by item, and the woman who had built it was in no condition to object. The jewelry collection, which was among the most famous private collections in the world, pieces given by a king to the woman he loved, pieces that carried the weight of a constitutional crisis in their settings and their stones, remained nominally intact during Wallis's lifetime, but became after her death the subject of one of the most spectacular public auctions of the 20th century. Wallis's physical and mental decline through the late 70s and into the 80s was severe and unrelenting. She suffered from arteriosclerosis and other conditions that progressively stripped her of the capacities that had defined her for 7 decades. Her wit, her social sharpness, her ability to read a room and manage it, her awareness of the world around her, her very sense of who she was and what she had been. By the early 1980s, she was, by the fragments of information that those outside the house managed to gather, bedridden for extended periods, largely uncommunicative, sustained by medical care, and attended by nurses, fed through a tube at some point during her final years. The contrast with the woman she had been, the woman who had managed a king, run a household that rivaled embassies in its precision, curated every dinner party and every flower arrangement and every social encounter with the attention to detail of a master conductor rehearsing an orchestra, was total, irrevocable, and devastating. She was alive technically, medically, in the narrowest biological sense of the word. But the person who had inhabited the life, the person who had made the choices and managed the consequences and endured the exile and kept the house running through 3.5 decades of purposeless perfection, that person was gone. And what remained was a body in a bed in a house in Paris, carrying a title that no one had ever fully honored, bearing a name that the world associated with a love story she had never asked for, attended by people she had not selected, in conditions she could not assess or challenge or change. Meanwhile, in the world outside the Villa Windsor, the romantic version of the story continued to circulate with the persistence of a myth that serves too many purposes to be easily displaced. The image of the Duke and Duchess, glamorous, devoted, exiled for love, the couple who proved that even a king would sacrifice everything for the right woman, remained one of the most powerful narratives of the 20th century, reproduced in magazines, referenced in fashion, invoked whenever anyone wanted to argue that love could conquer institutional power. The reality is that the sacrifice had produced not liberation, but a gilded form of imprisonment, that the love had been shadowed by dependency and exhaustion, that the woman at the center of the story was now spending her last years isolated and diminished in a house she could no longer control, was known to almost no one outside the shrinking circle of people who had once been admitted to the Duchess's presence and who were now shut out of it. In 1978, ITV broadcast Edward and Mrs. Simpson, a dramatization that starred Edward Fox as the Duke and Cynthia Harris as Wallis, and that presented the abdication story with sympathy and dramatic flair. The series reinforced the love story reading. The king who sacrificed everything, the woman for whom he sacrificed it, the romance that shook an empire, what it could not show, because the material had not yet entered the public record, was the darker reading, the dependency, the management, the suffocation, the slow erosion of both their lives into something that looked more like captivity than freedom. The dramatization captured the crisis brilliantly. It captured almost nothing of the exile that followed, because the exile was not dramatic in the way television requires. It was slow, repetitive, airless, and defined by the absence of anything happening rather than the presence of events. The story would continue to be retold and reassessed across the decades that followed, each retelling reflecting the preoccupations and sympathies of its own era. The Crown, Netflix's dramatization of the Elizabethan monarchy, would devote sustained and serious attention to the Windsors across its early seasons, treating the abdication not as a historical footnote, but as the foundational event of Elizabeth's reign, the original sin, in structural, if not moral terms, from which every subsequent tension in the modern monarchy descended. Alex Jennings played the Duke in the first two seasons with a mixture of charm, petulance, and bewildered self pity that captured the biographical portrait more accurately and more sympathetically than any previous dramatization had managed. The series showed the Queen Mother's anger, not as simple bitterness, but as the righteous fury of a woman who had watched her husband's health destroyed by a burden that was never meant to be his. It showed the family's institutional coldness, the calculated distance, the title withheld, the visits permitted but never warm, the boundary maintained across decades with the quiet implacability of a system that had learned from the abdication itself that sentiment was a threat to survival. It showed, most importantly, the fundamental incompatibility between Edward's emotional needs and the system his father had built, the irreconcilable collision between a man who needed love above all things and an institution that demanded the suppression of personal need as its basic condition of membership. For millions of viewers across the world, The Crown became the definitive visual version of the Windsor story, and its version was closer to the complicated truth than any previous telling had been, precisely because it had the space, across hours rather than minutes, across season rather than episodes, to hold the competing truths in tension rather than collapsing them into a single narrative. The biographical literature deepened across these decades as well. Anne Seba's work placed Wallis at the center of the story in a way that earlier biographies, which had tended to focus on the Duke and the constitutional crisis, had not. Seba's reading that Wallis had never wanted the endpoint, that she had been drawn into a situation whose consequences far exceeded anything she had anticipated, that her life in exile was a form of sentence rather than a reward, shifted the critical conversation significantly. Other biographers, including Hugo Vickers and Philip Ziegler, contributed their own readings, each adding layers to a portrait that grew more complex and more troubling with every new piece of evidence that emerged. The academic and popular reassessment of the Windsor story was, by the early 21st century, well underway, and its direction was clear, away from the fairy tale and toward the recognition that the greatest love story of the 20th century was also, and perhaps primarily, a story about the cost of emotional dependency, institutional rigidity, and the particular cruelty of exile administered by those who share your name. In 2026, Joan Collins starred in My Duchess, a film that brought the story back to public attention with a focus on Wallis's later years, the period that had been, for decades, the least examined and most disturbing part of the narrative. The film's very existence signaled something important about the cultural reassessment that had been underway for years. The gradual, hard-won shift from seeing Wallis as the villainess who stole a king to seeing her as a woman trapped by forces she had never fully controlled, whose story did not end with the romance, but continued in increasingly harrowing and neglected circumstances for decades after the fairy tale was supposed to have reached its conclusion. The casting of Collins, an actress whose own career had been defined by the playing of formidable, glamorous, misunderstood women, was itself a statement about how the culture's understanding of Wallis had evolved. She was no longer the femme fatale. She was the survivor. And the story being told about her was no longer the story of how she brought down a king, but the story of what happened to her after the king fell. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, died on April the 24th, 1986, at the Villa Windsor in Paris. She was 89 years old. She had outlived her husband by nearly 14 years. She had spent those years in the house he had once shared with her, surrounded by the objects she had chosen and the rooms she had designed, attended by staff she had not selected and governed by a lawyer whose authority she could not challenge. The death was reported internationally, as it was bound to be, but it did not provoke the kind of public mourning or media frenzy that the Duke's death had generated 14 years earlier. The romantic story had ended in 1972. What happened after that, and the isolation, the decline, the quiet horror of Bloom's regime, was not the kind of story the public wanted to hear, and so the public, for the most part, did not hear it. The death was quiet. After 14 years of isolation, decline, and the slow erasure of everything she had been, the end came without drama, without witnesses from the world, that had once orbited around her without the attention that had accompanied every phase of her life since 1936. The woman who had been the most famous in the world, the woman whose name was synonymous with a constitutional crisis, a romantic myth, and a half century of exile, died in a house that had become, in her final years, both monument and prison. She had outlived her purpose. She had outlived her capacity. She had outlived, by 14 years, the man whose need had defined the shape of her adult life. She was buried at Frogmore, in the grounds of Windsor Castle, beside her husband. The burial was attended by the Queen and other members of the royal family. It was, in death, the act of acceptance that had been denied in life, a recognition that whatever the family felt about the marriage, the woman who had borne the Windsor name for nearly 50 years was entitled to rest beside the man who had given it to her. The gesture was quiet, dignified, and final. There was no grand ceremony. There were no crowds. Just a burial in the grounds of a castle that bore the name a king had invented in 1917, beside the man who had carried that name into exile in 1936, in the presence of a family that had spent half a century calibrating the precise distance at which it was prepared to hold a woman who now lay in its soil. The jewelry went to auction at Sotheby's in Geneva in 1987. The sale was extraordinary, a cultural event as much as a commercial one. The collection fetched approximately £31 million, vastly exceeding expectations, and the buyers included collectors, museums, and members of the public for whom the Windsor jewels represented something more than precious stones. They were relics of the romance. They were the tangible remnants of the most famous love story of the century, and their dispersal across the world's auction rooms marked the final dissolution of the physical world that Wallis had spent her life assembling. The Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne passed through various hands after Wallis's death. It was eventually leased to Mohammed Al Fayed, who restored the property and preserved its Windsor-era interiors with what he described as respect for its historical significance. Later, the property came under the stewardship of the Foundation Mansar. The house exists today as a physical remnant of the exile, a building that still carries the atmosphere of the world Wallis created, still holds the memory of the dinners and the flowers and the silver and the decades of meticulous, purposeless domestic governance. Le Moulin de la Tuileries, the country property at Gif-sur-Yvette that Wallis had transformed into a charming weekend retreat, the place where the couple had entertained friends in a setting more intimate and relaxed than the formal grandeur of the Villa Windsor, was sold after Wallis's death and passed into private hands. The Bahamas have their own memories of the wartime governorship. Fort Belvedere, where the instrument of abdication was signed, remains within the Crown estate and is periodically leased as a private residence. Each property is a marker on the map of the Windsor's trajectory, from Windsor Great Park to the Bois de Boulogne, from the center of an empire to its most elegant margin. The buildings remain. The people who lived in them are gone. And the spaces they occupied, the rooms they decorated, the gardens they walked, the hallways through which the Duke followed Wallis, and Wallis managed the Duke, and the staff served both, and the lawyer eventually controlled everything. Those spaces are now historical curiosities, visited or photographed or documented by people for whom the Windsor story is not a lived reality, but a chapter in the long, strange history of what the British monarchy demanded of the people who carried its name. Frogmore, where the Duke and Duchess lie together, is within the home park of Windsor Castle. It is not open to the public except on limited occasions. The graves are marked with flat ledger stones side by side, beneath a plane tree. There are no crowds. There are no pilgrims. There is no shrine to the romance that the world believed in for so long, and that the evidence, accumulated across decades of biographical scholarship and personal testimony, has revealed to be something far more complicated, far more troubling, and far more human than any fairy tale could accommodate. They are simply there, together in death as they were in life. The man who could not be without her, and the woman who could not escape him, resting in the soil of a castle whose name was invented by a king who understood what they never did. That the crown is not a love story. It is a discipline, and when the discipline fails, the cost falls on everyone. The sale raised approximately £31 million, vastly exceeding the pre-sale estimates and confirming what the organizers had understood, that the Windsor jewelry represented something beyond its material value. Each piece was a relic of the romance, a tangible remnant of the most famous love story of the century, and the buyers, collectors, museums, dealers, and members of the public who had never owned anything remotely comparable were purchasing not just stones and setting, but a connection to the myth. The dispersal of the jewels across the world's auction rooms marked the final dissolution of the physical world that Wallis had spent her life assembling. The house had been her stage set. The jewelry had been her armor. Both were gone. The Duke and Duchess left no children. There are no descendants. The Windsor line, as it flowed through Edward, ended with him. The dynasty continued, but it continued through his brother, through the stammering second son who never wanted the crown, whose wife never forgave the woman who forced it upon him, and whose daughter would carry it for 70 years with the discipline and self-abnegation that Edward could never summon. The institutional inheritance passed to Elizabeth, and through her to Charles and to the generations that followed. The crown sits today on a head that would not have worn it if a man in 1936 had been capable of bearing his own. The personal inheritance, the emotional residue of what the abdication meant, the particular weight it placed on every subsequent occupant of the throne, the unspoken but ever-present awareness that the monarchy's survival depended on the suppression of exactly the kind of private need that Edward had placed above everything else. That inheritance is still being carried. It is still being managed, still being absorbed, still being reckoned with by a family that learned in December 1936, at a cost that would take decades to fully reveal itself. What happens when one of its members refuses to disappear inside the role that the institution requires and the nation demands? There is a pattern in this family's story that resists the simplicity of any single explanation, any clean moral, any lesson that could be extracted and placed on a plaque above a doorway. It is the pattern of people who were asked to convert their private incapacity into others' duty. A king who could not bear the code and whose failure to bear it fell on his brother's wife, on his brother's daughter, and on the woman he said he loved, who spent 35 years managing the consequences of his inability and then spent 14 more years losing the ability to manage anything at all in a house that remained beautiful because beauty was the only thing left to maintain, at a desk where the ink was kept fresh and the paper clips were kept straight for a man who was never coming back to use them.